Good afternoon. For those of you who do not know me, I'm Jake Cordes, and I was asked to give a brief welcome this afternoon. Before we get started with that, I'd like to open with the Pledge of Allegiance. So if you would join me. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Once again, my name is Jake Cordes, and up until about a month ago, I served as a member of the Farmington School Board. My tenure on the board lasted for 8 years, and during that time, we as a board, along with our administration, worked very hard to change the way we educated students in Farmington. We realized that for far too long, students have been educated using the same industrial model that has been used for over 150 years. So we changed the focus. We shifted away from that antiquated system and instead focused on our students. We focused on ways to give teachers the freedom to identify student sparks, that is their passions. We focused on ways to honor the teachers and the students' agency, that is honoring their own voice and their choice in how they learn best. And because of that work, we were able to excite our teachers and our students about their educational experience. And I can tell you from anecdotal evidence that the work we began 8 years ago has paid off. I hear from countless former students and parents that our students are far more ready than their peers for college, careers, military service, or whatever their post-high school plans are. Now, I could continue to talk about what Farmington has done for the next hour. Anybody on this call who knows me knows that to be true. But the reason we're here today is not to hear about Farmington. What we want to talk about is how we can improve the education for every student in Minnesota. Our students' futures should not be determined by what zip code they live in. Our students' futures should not be determined by their race, and our students' futures should not be determined by their socioeconomic status. No, my friends, all of our students in Minnesota should have access to high-quality public education, and this education should prepare them for all facets of life beyond high school. Something needs to change. I was very excited when I first heard about the proposed amendment from Justice Page and President Kashkari, and even more excited to connect with Mary and Beth and some of the other folks working on this endeavor. And I'm excited today to have this opportunity to share this information with education, business, and community leaders from around the state. This amendment will guarantee that no matter what, all students in Minnesota will have access to a high-quality public education that will prepare them fully to participate in the economy, our democracy, and our society. To me, this doesn't seem controversial. To me, this sounds like common sense, and it makes sense to many people. Political and business leaders from across the state, representing the right, the left, and the center, have come to the realization that it's time to make a seismic change to the way we look at education, and realize that this amendment is the way to do just that. And today we are coming together, and we have some of those leaders with us who are leading the charge. Before I introduce our guest speakers for today, I'd just like to really quick thank and introduce some of the other co-hosts today. We have Patrick Wells and Frank Johnson with the St. Louis Park Kiwanis, and a special thank you to the Pipestone Kiwanis for joining us as well, and Kavitha Sitaram, one of our other co-hosts. We're joined by former Minnesota Supreme Court Justice Alan Page. Many know Justice Page from his time in the NFL, playing for the Vikings, where he was a member of the famed Purple People Eaters, and is widely considered one of the best defensive linemen to play the game. In addition, he is a National Hall of Fame member, and in 1992, he was elected to the Minnesota Supreme Court, where he served until his retirement in 2015. He and his wife, Diane, started the Page Education Foundation, which gives financial assistance to children of color all across the state to attend post-secondary school. Our other guest is the president and CEO of the Minneapolis Federal Reserve Bank, Neel Kashkari. President Kashkari was named the president in 2015, and the Minneapolis Federal Reserve Bank is one of the Fed's 12 regional banks, with a district including Minnesota, Montana, the Dakotas, and parts of Wisconsin and Michigan. Prior to his appointment, Neel worked in the United States Department of Treasury, where notably he was the assistant secretary during the 2008 financial crisis, where he oversaw the Troubled Asset Relief Program, and he was a candidate for governor of California. Both of these men are working tirelessly to improve our students' access to education, and it is my pleasure today to introduce them. Justice Page, President Kashkari, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jacob, for that great introduction. Thank you, everyone, for being here and for inviting us to join you. We really appreciate it. Let me kick off, and then I'm going to turn it over to Alan. So I moved to Minnesota 5 years ago. And before I came to Minnesota, I'd done some homework, and I knew that on average, Minnesota had a highly educated workforce. On average, Minnesota had good schools. So I was really surprised when I got here to discover that Minnesota has some of the worst education disparities in the nation, both racial disparities that are concentrated in the Twin Cities, not only in the Twin Cities, but concentrated there, but also statewide, that low-income white Minnesotans are badly trailing their middle class and more well-to-do peers. So I asked my researchers at the Minneapolis Fed to help me understand what's going on, what's been done to try to close these gaps, what can we learn from that, what can we learn from other states. And what we learned was, what we discovered was that there have been many good faith attempts in the past 20 or 30 years by hardworking, well-meaning people to close these disparities in Minnesota. But you can find pockets of progress, but if you look at the statistics across the state, statewide, we've made zero progress, despite all of that hard work. And when you look around the country, that's not true everywhere. There are states that have made real progress. Some people will say, no, you're putting too much on the schools. It's not about the schools. It's really about poverty. You have to address poverty. Well, other states that have made progress in elevating all of their students, they still have poverty too. And it turns out the most powerful tool we have to solve poverty is, in fact, education. People who get a good education, that's how you break the cycle of poverty. So my observation was that it seems like politics is getting in the way, that this is a divided state. Different parties have different philosophies. They don't agree on a lot. So what do? They agree on making changes around the margin, but the fundamental system is left intact. And it's the system that is failing the students, not the teachers. So more than 2 years ago, I reached out to Justice Page, both because he spent 22 years on Minnesota's Supreme Court and because, as you said, he and his wife founded the Page Education Foundation. I knew he had a lifetime of passion for education equity. And I asked him, is there a way we could use the law to literally put children first and break these political barriers that have prevented real reforms from taking place? So we started by looking at the Minnesota State Constitution. And the Minnesota Constitution has an education provision that was written in 1857. And it has not really changed since 1857. And just as a quick reminder, in 1857, slavery was still legal in much of America. That's how outdated it is. And that provision, sorry, I'm listening to something jumping upstairs. That provision basically says that children have the right to access an adequate education system. Well, what does that mean, an adequate education system? That's a system that is on average adequate. It works great for some students, it's lousy for others, and on average it's adequate. And if you or your child has access to that system, whether they're at the top of the system or the bottom of that system, their rights have been met. Well, it strikes us that the education system today in Minnesota is working exactly as the Constitution has defined it. An adequate system overall works great for some, works lousy for others. And when we looked around the country, there are states that have updated their constitutions to say, no, we could do better than adequate. We should do quality. And we should make this a civil right. So I'm going to summarize that. I'm going to hand it over to Justice Page. Fundamentally, what are we talking about? We want to create a civil right for every child in Minnesota to have a quality public education. And then most importantly, or equally importantly, make it the state's highest responsibility to deliver on that right. We think this can be a very powerful catalyst to break through all the political barriers and literally put children first, so that the teachers and the parents and the administrators can design the education system of the future to meet the needs of those students in their communities. We don't think at all this is going to be one size fits all. We think the civil rights should be there for every Minnesota student, but then the families, the teachers, the parents should determine what is best for the kids in their schools. So with that brief overview, let me turn it over to Alan.
Thank you, Neel, and thank you for having us this evening. Neel said it well. We need to start putting children first, and that is what our proposed constitutional amendment does. Indeed, it literally puts children first. Our current constitution the language of it focuses on the system and the funding of that system. And indeed, when we go out and talk to people, the conversation is always about the system. We think in order to bring about real change, we need to shift the focus, not to exclude, but to shift the focus to include children. And in doing that, putting children first. And so we've developed this language, all children. And when we say all children, we mean literally all children, whether they're Black children, brown children, indigenous children, urban children, rural children, wealthy children, poor children, able-bodied or disabled children. All children have a fundamental right to a quality public education. And there is some suggestion that, well, what does quality mean? Well, the constitutional language tells us, the proposed language tells us, quality public education that fully prepares them with the skills necessary for participation in our economy, in the economy, our democracy, and society. That's what quality means: full preparation for participation in our economy, our democracy, and our society. As measured against uniform achievement standards set forth by the state. What does that language mean? I can tell you what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean constitutionalizing the current regimen that we have of measuring performance today. The tools that we use today, the standardized tests that Minnesota's children are required to take, really doesn't measure much of anything other than the snapshot of where they are on a particular day at a particular time. Doesn't provide any guidance as to how they got there or what they can do to improve their educational experience. Doesn't do any of that. We think that there needs to be some measure of performance. Otherwise, how do we tell that children are being educated? And as Neel pointed out, as important as anything, this last sentence of the proposed amendment, it is a paramount duty of the state to ensure quality public schools that fulfill this fundamental right. That is to say, the state would have no higher duty than to ensure quality public schools. And emphasis on quality public schools and quality public education. There are those who suggest that somehow this proposed amendment is just a vehicle for privatizing public education. That's nonsense. The reality is that if today the legislature enacted and the governor signed a bill that took Minnesota down the privatization of public education road, they can do that under the Constitution amendment we have. It's true that they could also do it under our proposal with one, I think, significant difference. And that is because it would be the paramount duty of the state to ensure quality public schools. They couldn't privatize public education at the expense of public education. That would be unconstitutional. The other piece that's important in that last sentence is that it's the paramount duty of the state. It becomes a state responsibility to ensure quality public schools and quality public education. And finally, when I talk about the state, I'm talking about the legislative branch of our government, the executive branch of our government, and the judicial branch. And I know there are those who are concerned that involving the judicial branch will create additional expense. I have to tell you, a right without a remedy is not much of a right. We have had since 1857 the opportunity to educate children in a way that didn't result in the disparities in proficiency that we see today. We haven't had the right to a quality public education either. I think that this proposed language will be the catalyst. And yes, is it a blunt stick? Yes. But the carrot is the ability to create quality public education. And the stick being, if we don't do that, children whose rights have been denied have the stick of going to court and demanding that their rights be vindicated. That is something that, if you look back at our history, how have we dealt with our rights? Think about the First Amendment. The courts enforce that. Think about the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment. It is courts that have brought those rights to life. Think about Brown versus the Board of Education. While Brown may not have fulfilled all of its promise, it single-handedly sounded the death knell for state-sponsored segregation in this country. The courts can be a powerful ally in ensuring that children have their rights to a quality public education vindicated. If there was some indication that the opposition to having the courts involved was anything more than really a vote for the status quo, I would be happy to hear it. But as best I can tell, those who oppose what we seek to do, is they're really talking about the status quo. And the reality is that because the problems are systematic and systemic, the system has to change. That is the only way to bring about systemic change. Neel, do you have anything to add?
Just very briefly, I mean, I think we're at a gut check moment for Minnesota. You know, we talk a lot about equity and closing disparities and equality. We've had George Floyd's murder, we've got COVID, all these disparities that existed before are now exacerbated. And the question is, are we serious? Are we serious as a state about really elevating all of the children of Minnesota? I hope the answer is yes. But one little fact that I don't know if I mentioned, I had my staff go back and look at how many bills in Minnesota on education have become law in the last 15 years. We counted 122 bills have become law on education. So there's great interest in education. And collectively, what difference did they make? Nothing that we can tell. And so, you know, Einstein has that famous quip of insanity is repeating the same behavior and expecting a different outcome. We need to do something fundamentally different that elevates children and makes this the highest priority of the state. And this amendment is the most powerful way we could come up with to doing that. You know, Alan talked about the role of the courts. That's something we hear a lot about. Legislators say, oh, we're afraid the courts are going to step in and do our jobs. And we say, well, look, after this passes, it will be up to the legislature and the governor to create a process to get input from the people of Minnesota to design the system of the future. So you're going to have the first bite at the apple, and only if you fail to act would the courts then have any reason to need to weigh in on this matter. But other things we've heard, Alan touched on it. He said that some opponents said, oh, this is going to lead to vouchers or privatization. Couldn't be further from the truth. Attorney General Ellison has also confirmed, couldn't be further from the truth, that this does not lead to vouchers. This somehow reduces the state's requirement to fund schools. Again, couldn't be further from the truth. This amendment makes public education the highest priority of the state. How that can lead to less money, that just doesn't make any sense. So if anything, it would lead to more money. So the opposition that we've heard, in my mind, has really just confirmed that we're on the right track, that those have not been actual substantive disagreements. They've at best been more misunderstandings.
I would just note that, thinking about the courts again, we've also done some research that shows that changing state constitutional education clauses doesn't lead to more cases at the appellate court level. That is to say that it just doesn't happen. And so I don't know what else to add to that. You know, what we're really talking about is individualized education, so that all children can reach their true potential, have the opportunity to reach their true potential, so that we educate the children that are in the classroom. Neel pointed out that, you know, people say, no, we've got to fix poverty, and some say we've got to fix families. Well, before we can really make a dent in these performance differences. And to me, that's just a way of saying we like the status quo, or that these children really can't learn. The problem is that we're just not teaching them. They can learn if we teach them the way they need to be taught. That requires some individualization, as opposed to some systematic, some system of education that is more important than the actual education of the children.
You know, if you look, so this has been done in some other states, as I mentioned. Some other states have updated their constitutions. If you look in the late 90s in Florida, they amended their constitution, 97, 98, and they said focus on quality. And at that time, Florida and Minnesota were roughly even in the mid 30s in terms of achievement gap between children of color and white children, as an example. After they amended their constitution, the governor of Florida and the legislature came together and made sweeping changes. They shrunk class sizes, they invested more, they invested in teacher training, they gave parents more choices, they did a whole suite of things. 20 years later, Minnesota is exactly where we were in the late 90s, haven't moved an inch, and Florida has climbed to 6th. They've climbed almost 30 spaces in 20 years. And let me tell you something, Florida has poverty too. Florida has families that have challenges too. And so we're not saying we should be Florida, we should do what Florida did in terms of their specific reforms. That'll be up for the people and the teachers to decide, and the legislature and the governor. But the point is, you can absolutely do this if this is really your highest priority. And that's why I keep coming back to, are we serious?
I would note that this proposed amendment also empowers teachers. I mean, teachers are critical to
Very good.
the whole education process. And our proposed amendment empowers families. It also empowers teachers. And we think that's very important.
I can start sharing questions if you'd like me to.
Great, thank you.
Okay, before I share questions, I just want to say thank you to the two of you for coming here. You both command national level speaking fees, but you're doing this for the goodness of it. And that's really good of you. It's awesome. I'd also like to say thanks to Beth, Jake, Meredith, Kavitha, Paul, Patrick, and others who have made a lot of effort to make this possible and to make it a quality program. So first question I have that's come in is, tell us about those school districts that have special extra funding through voter approved additions.
Well, I guess the question is, how would this amendment affect them? I mean, ultimately, the amendment is meant to be, so it creates the individual civil right for each individual child. And then essentially, it's the state's responsibility to support the education of that child, whatever he or she needs. So some children are going to need early childhood education support from the very earliest years. My children, I've got 2 young children. We're fortunate we have the resources to provide that ourselves, so we wouldn't need that. The point is, the state would have to look at district by district, school by school, and ultimately student by student to say, does this student getting the resources and the support that he or she needs in order to learn to reach their full potential? So in some districts where they've got more money coming in locally, they might need less from the state. Another district where they don't have those resources, they might need more support from the state. The point is, it's not one size fits all. It's what does the individual child need?
The only thing I would tag onto that is, this, while how education is financed is important, but these failures aren't all financial. We have to fix those things that don't cost money.
Okay, I have a question for you. Give a hypothetical of how a student would make use of this amendment to improve their education.
The first thing is, as we mentioned, we think this will be a catalyst to move the legislature and the governor to create a process with the people to design the education system of the future. So that's the first thing, what reforms they would put in place that they're not able to put in place today. But then, Alan, maybe you could also talk, if that doesn't work, then what does a family do?
Well, and I suppose it's a fair question, but the question presupposes that the opportunity won't be there, that the system won't be created. I think the reality has been, in places where they have made change, constitutional change, that the systems have changed. And they've put in, the people have come together with their elected officials, the educators, administrators, families, children. They've come together and put in place a system that works, that allows the individual child to reach their full potential. And by the way, this doesn't reduce any obligation on children and families to be involved in the educational process. It just makes sure that the system is providing the needs of individual children that will allow them to reach their full potential. And so I suppose, let's say the system isn't vindicating a given child's civil right to a quality public education. And suppose the child wants to litigate that. Well, that's an option, but it seems to me that if the system is failing, the answer is to come together for families, parents, schools, teachers, and figure out how to fix the system, as opposed to simply saying, well, this is a matter for litigation. Defending the indefensible, which is what we do today, is not required. We need to change the system as it exists. And I suspect I don't know, but I suspect there will be no more litigation and maybe less.
You know, just one more comment to build on something Alan said earlier. He talked about other amendments to the US Constitution. And I always think about the right to vote. So the right to vote was embedded in the US Constitution for white men from the start. And then the 15th Amendment gave freed slaves the right to vote, and the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote. You probably couldn't imagine what the changes that would lead to over time. I mean, it's so fundamental, participating in our democracy. And I imagine, I'm sure at the time there were lots of objections to it. And if somebody denies you the right to vote, well, yeah, you better go to court and say, hey, my right to vote, my right to participate in democracy has been denied. And so we're talking about a catalyst for transformational change of our education system from a system that was rooted in 1857 to a modern system for our modern society and our modern economy. And if people need to go to court ultimately to say, hey, my rights are not being fulfilled, then that's what they should do. And like Alan talked about Brown versus Board of Education, that was a poor family bringing that case, and it led to transformation for everyone. That's the power of civil rights. If one family brings one case, you don't need to then go get a lawyer to benefit from that. We all benefit from that because the changes are spread throughout our society.
Okay, I have another one. Once this amendment is passed into law, will this hold the state accountable to do what you say? What will the district's responsibility be?
I'm sorry, go ahead, Alan.
I was just going to say, at the end of the day, the responsibility is the state's. And how the state goes about fulfilling that obligation, you know, they will sort that out. But at the end of the day, the state will be responsible for failing to educate children.
And so our expectation is that, of course, they'll work through the districts. And some districts have said, oh, we're worried that this is going to open us up to litigation. If any litigation is coming, I would see that it's litigation of the districts against the state, saying, hey, you're not giving us the resources and the support that we need in order to fulfill the rights of the children in our communities. That's why saying the state is on the hook is so important. So the districts are going to have a critical role to play because, again, the learning needs to be customized at the local level with the teachers and the principals and the parents really in control. But the state needs to provide the support that those districts need in order to be successful.
Who has already signed on in support? Have Kurt Dowd, Melissa Horton, Paul Gazelka, Susan Kent, or Tom Bach weighed in? Is there reason to believe there could be bipartisan support for this? Have other forces weighed in?
Well, there's definitely bipartisan support. We have united Democrats of color from the DFL party with conservative Republicans from greater Minnesota, which we're really excited about. We united, Attorney General Ellison with the Minnesota Business Partnership, the CEOs of the biggest businesses in Minnesota. I mean, these are folks that don't normally work together, don't normally see eye to eye on issues, but they all agree we can't keep doing what we've been doing and we need to put children first. So we're working hard to earn support of leaders in both parties. We've met with the governor a few times. We're working hard to earn his support. We need all of us pulling in the same direction to get this done.
Could a court order specific performance by a school district?
Well, courts make decisions based on the facts presented and the law. And if they conclude that someone's rights have been denied, they don't make up remedies out of whole cloth. They don't just decide, well, we think because we're judges, we think this should be the solution. They make decisions based on what the parties bring to them. And so, I don't know that I would say that they might order specific performance or not. It just depends on a given set of facts. And, I can't think of a hypothetical right now that I can use to sort of articulate that, other than to say, to make clear that courts will make their decisions based on the facts and the law. And they're not going to decide to make a decision just because they think it's a good idea. I mean, sometimes as a judge, you have to make decisions that on a personal level you think is a bad idea. I mean, courts do that all the time. And so this fear, these concerns about what courts may or may not do, they're fact dependent.
Thank you. Question for Neel. Why does the Fed care about this?
Yeah, good question. The United States Congress has assigned the Federal Reserve, our goals. We call them our mandates. One of our mandates is to try to achieve maximum employment, which means as many Americans as possible gainfully employed and participating in our economy. I mean, that's obviously good for everybody if we can get more people working. Well, and we try to do that by adjusting interest rates up and down. But the single most important determinant of an individual's success in the job market is the education that he or she received. People with more and better education have more job opportunities. They generally earn higher wages. By the way, they then get access to better healthcare, better housing, on and on. These wonderful benefits to that family or that individual flow from education. But it's core to our mandate. So we don't set education policy, but education policy is so important to us being able to achieve our goal of maximum employment that the US Congress has assigned us.
In your opinion, does this impact parents who choose homeschooling for their kids?
Not at
No,
all.
not at all.
Yeah. I mean, just to be clear, you just go back to the right to vote. You have the right to vote. You do not have an obligation to vote. And so we want to create the right for every child to be able to receive this quality public education. But if their parents want to homeschool them, that will always be their right.
What is the legislative process for something like this?
Well, it takes, to get on the ballot, the proposed amendment has to pass both houses of the legislature. And if 50+1% of each house votes to have it put on the ballot, it goes on the ballot. The governor doesn't have a right or any role in the process. The governor can't either approve it or disapprove it. It goes on the ballot if the two houses pass it. Then it goes on the ballot and the citizens of Minnesota decide whether or not we should put children first, whether this amendment gets passed or not. And we hope to have it on the ballot for the next general election, which would be 2022. And in that election, it would have to be voted, it would have to be approved by 50+1% of the people voting in that election.
And I would just note that, Alan and I are meeting with anybody who wants to meet with us to talk about this idea and why we think it's important. A separate campaign group has been formed called Our Children Minnesota. They've hired a campaign manager. They have hired lobbyists. They're raising money. They're actively working at the Capitol virtually to advocate on behalf of this. And so if people are interested in learning more about their plans, we can provide the link. It's ourchildrenmn.com or org. I can't remember if it's org or com.
It's com.
Com. Thank you.
Ourchildren.com.
Ourchildrenmn.com.
And we could donate there?
If that's what you chose to do, you get more information, you could, sure.
Your time, your resources, and your energy. We could use it all.
Okay. Several people have asked, how could we help? What could we do? And it sounds like connecting with ourchildrenmn.org or .com would be the place to go.
Yeah, they're organizing, in addition to, an official campaign, they're organizing grassroots activities at the school district level, across the whole state. So I think there are a lot of ways that people could participate if they were interested.
And the easiest and the most obvious is contact your legislators. Let them hear from you.
I think you have answered our questions. Thank you very much. And I will pass the torch.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining us today. I hope this was an informative session and that we've answered all your questions. Thank you also to Neel and Justice Page for spearheading the effort on this proposed amendment. And thank you also to all the panelists that I've worked with today. It's been a great session for me as well. If you've got any questions, please do refer to the ourchildrenmn.com website. You can also contact Beth Cummers, and I see that her email is in the chat. So with that, I'd like to thank all of you once again, and good night.